Good afternoon and namaste, everybody. Welcome to the second international conference by INDEC Researchers Forum. INDEC Researchers Forum is an independent research organization that researches on geopolitics, national security, culture, history, and social sciences through a civilizational perspective. The idea is to promote research and propagate the notion that the country has a civilizational heritage that is much larger and older than its recent history. Today's conference is on the great game in Indo Pacific, beginning of a new world order. I am Sneha Kathy Sebastian, your host for the session. Currently, I'm a research associate for the forum. In today's conference, we will talk about various topics like the challenges by India in the Indo Pacific region, the importance of Andaman and Nicobar, the BRI initiative, and India's maritime history. We will also look into disputes in the South China Sea, Chinese aggression, especially in the Himalayas, and the threat of Taiwan invading. The final session will look at the future of Indo-Pacific strategy and the impacts of Afghanistan crisis, Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy, and artificial intelligence in the Indo-Pacific region. Today, we will be having three sessions. Session 1 will be from 1:30 p.m. onwards, and this session will focus on assessing India's role and challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. Session 2 will be from 3 p.m. onwards. This session will discuss the rising threat of Chinese aggression and its geopolitical ramifications. Session 3 will be from 4:30 p.m. onwards. This session will analyze the opportunities and challenges faced by the Indo-Pacific strategy and the way forward. Now, we have an inaugural address by Professor Madhav Das Nalapat. Professor Nalapat was appointed India's first professor of geopolitics in 1998 by Manipal University. He is the vice chair of the Manipal Advanced Research Group at Manipal University and the editorial director at ITV Network. Professor Nalapat is a philosopher who has sought to redefine India's nationalism since the 1980s. He was appointed editor of Madhrubhumi Daily in 1984, and in the 1990s, he briefly edited the Times of India. Sir is the author of several books, and the latest being The Practice of Geopolitics. Professor Nalapat is an expert on religious extremism, national security, counterterrorism, foreign policy, and political strategy. He writes on security, policy, and international affairs and is a regular analyst and commentator on geopolitical issues for global and domestic television channels. We are delighted to have such an accomplished personnel as our guest today. Over to you, sir.
Uh, Thank you very much. I would like to say that I am delighted to speak and to open this very important forum by the Indic Researchers Group, by Yashash and the other colleagues, for the simple reason that you're discussing a very, very important subject. Except that I would make a small amendment in what you're saying. It's not the beginning of a new world order. It is what is happening is the existential battle that is going to determine the new world order. I don't think that battle has been won yet. And once it is won, and I'm certain that that is going to happen in a manner that we in India will welcome, then of course we will be beginning the work of the new world order. And I think the Indic Researchers Forum would do well to, at that point, also go ahead for a major, if I may say so, conference of this nature. I'd like to say that I'm totally honored to be allowed to speak to you for the simple reason there are some extremely distinguished participants on this panel, on the various panels, and they have a galaxy of experience and talent in the subject. So I'm going to be somewhat brief, if you don't mind, because I would not like to be in between such a galaxy of talent and those who are eager to listen to them. Well, I want to point out the obvious. And the obvious is that the Indo-Pacific today is a geopolitical, it is a geopolitical hub replacing the Atlantic. This was taking place ever since the 1980s, frankly, ever since the development of countries in Asia, particularly, and it accelerated in the 1990s. And I think by the close of the 1990s, I think it was clear that if the Indo-Pacific was not already the geopolitical center of gravity so far as the oceans are concerned, it is soon going to be. So that is something which I know everybody here knows by heart virtually. So I'm sorry to have to repeat it, but I just want to repeat in the context of my previous point, which is that what we are seeing today is a battle for the beginnings, for what will be the beginnings of a new order in the Indo Pacific. It's an existential battle. Now, I've had the good fortune or the bad fortune of looking at events and giving certain forecasts, only to have those forecasts, frankly, dismissed as slightly imaginary, and then maybe after about 5 years, we consider that possibly it's realistic. And 10 years later, people come back to me and say, this is what is happening. And they repeat my forecast of 10 years ago. So I'd only like to say that, I mean, it's good luck or bad luck. But I'd like to say that as of now, I can tell you, and I'm saying this with a certain degree of dismay, I cannot yet forecast who is going to be the winner in this existential battle. Certainly, in terms of comprehensive national power, the democracies have the upper hand. Certainly, in terms of talent, in terms of potential, especially our own country with its immense demographic potential, well, obviously, the democracies have the upper hand. But the point is that these kind of conflicts that determine the shape of the new world order, the 1945, the war which ended in 1945, determined the shape of the new world order. There was Bretton Woods, there was the American, if I may say so, the Cold War with the Soviet Union going into Eastern Europe, that defined those contours for a long, long time to come. Subsequently, well, this began, I would say, with the second, the second term of Hu Jintao. But Hu Jintao was he was very careful. He followed Deng Xiaoping's dictum of speak softly, but carry a big stick and make that stick bigger and more powerful as you go along. And he did that. But today, if I may say so, all camouflage is off. There is no camouflage. I mean, Xi Jinping has frankly torn up, for example, if I may say so, the 1981 party cleanup organized by Deng Xiaoping, in which it was said that Mao made 30% mistakes and 70% he was correct. I'm not sure if that should not be reversed, but Xi Jinping has very absolutely categorically said that Mao made no mistake at all. I mean, I'm not very sure why he has said that, because he has rehabilitated Confucius, for example. In several ways, he's quite different from Mao. But he says there was absolutely nothing wrong with Mao, and Maoism was great. I think he has been badly burnt, frankly, by the Khrushchev secret speech and by the fall in the respect for the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, as a consequence of Khrushchev's secret speech being leaked to a very large Russian audience. So they realized that Stalin was a colossus with feet of clay. Xi Jinping does not want Mao to be acknowledged as a colossus with even 30%, who is even 30% composed of clay. So he has said, no, this is absolute steel or titanium, 100%. Look, I would only like to say that we have absolutely the top brains in the country where military policy is concerned, and I'm sure that the researchers here are doing an amazing amount of work on coming up with new hypotheses. And I'd like to encourage you to go ahead with new hypotheses, because frankly, many of the old hypotheses have just not been working and they should be discontinued. But unfortunately, policies, hypotheses, academic discussions, we don't have an expiry date. So they are talked about, they are disseminated, decisions are taken on their basis long past the expiry date. One of them being the reality that it's high time, for example, that the uniformed services are integrated into the Ministry of Defense and the security services are integrated into the Ministry of Home Affairs. Now, the External Affairs Ministry has formed a cadre of its own foreign policy. It served us well. You have, for example, the Atomic Energy Department. You have, for example, the Space Department. Both of them are led by experts. Experts are the secretaries, not generalist officers. And pardon me for saying so, but I think it's not rocket science. ISRO would like this to say that these are departments that have done very well. And therefore, I believe that this experiment needs to be tried out on a large scale, as indeed it is being tried out in so many democracies across the world. Long past the expiry date, we are continuing with a host of such policies. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this to this distinguished audience because wars are not necessarily won by weakness on the part of the enemy or by the enemy having less power or less ability than our side. Wars can also be made, war can also be won by, wars can be made by mistakes, and wars can be won or lost by errors on our side. Let's say we make errors, then a war that can be won can be lost. And if the other side, now we have Cold War 2.0, the US is basically front and center on one side, democracy is front and center on one side, and you have authoritarianism represented by China, the two superpowers. Now, the question is really, and I've seen this happen, for example, in many tennis matches, the player who makes the least mistakes comes out and wins the match. In a chess game, the player who makes the least mistakes comes out and wins the match. He may be a lucky player, but whatever the reason, if the opponent makes a lot of mistakes, he makes less mistakes, well, the match goes to him or her. I'd like to say. And I'd like to, so that is my point very clearly. And that's why I hope that this conference is going to examine these things in detail in a very comprehensive manner so that we can understand what is going right with us, what is going wrong with us, what needs to be changed. Because this is the era of both threat as well as opportunity. And again, I'm telling you something which is fairly obvious to everybody. I'm sorry if I'm repeating this, but if you invite a professor, well, sometimes he repeats the lectures that he has given, and sometimes the same student attends the lecture. Well, you can see the student being a little less attentive, and then you can understand he's heard this lecture before. But I'd only like to say, we are at a point of inflection in the history of our country. Forget the history of our country. The Indo-Pacific, which is today the geopolitical center of sea power, just as the Eurasian continent is the center of land power. Now, this has now become the pivot of geopolitics, and it is now at an inflectional point as to which set of countries is going to come out on top in this battle for primacy initially and then dominance. Make no mistake, it is an existential battle. The Cold War 1.1 was fought on the basis of it being an existential battle of objectives and systems. Well, I'd like to ask in what way this is not an existential battle of objectives and systems, because in Xi Jinping thought, and I'd like to say that I've studied Mao Zedong's thought. I mean, I know that I can't be called an expert in that, I'm sure, but the reality is I've studied it in detail. Some of my old friends in China believe that, okay, I know quite a bit about it, and they, either, real or not. But the reality is that I've also studied Xi Jinping's thought. And once Xi Jinping, 2013, 2014, 2015, once these years we saw what he was doing, a lot of the earlier speeches, a lot of the earlier writings that frankly all of us really never bothered to think about have suddenly emerged very relevant. It reminds me of the Arab Spring, when I pointed out that the Arab Spring is going to be followed by a Wahhabi winter. And lo and behold, a lot of that Wahhabi winter was funded from the from NATO and the Western allies because they didn't read the pre, if I may say so, the pre-romance, fulminations of those they were funding. If they read, for example, some of the so-called freedom fighters they were funding in Syria, in Libya, they would have found out that these freedom fighters regard the West as the existential enemy more deadly than any other enemy. So, unfortunately, they did not read that. Vast amounts of money were transferred to them, weapons and training was transferred to them, and we have had a rash of terror attacks, which is still continuing as a consequence of that, and some other decisions that were made in the past, such as trusting the Pakistan military to fight the very unfortunate, unpleasant, and unjust Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, but not doing that with patriotic nationalist Pashtuns, but doing that with extremist Pashtuns. The nationalist Pashtun is anathema to the Pakistan military. The nationalist Pashtun is the individual who could have defeated the Russians much quicker than what these extremist Pashtuns did. And that menace is now still on us, as you can see. I'd like to end, Sneha, by coming back to something I wrote back in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken, in the Times of India. And that's called Hindutva. And my point there was again a point which possibly is very obvious to a lot of people, but I'd like to say at least the Times of India, nobody carried it that kind of view except the first time. Why? What is Hindutva? Hindutva says that Indian culture, the DNA of Indian culture, is a compound of the Vedic, the Mughal, and the Western. All three are parts of that DNA. It cannot be that any single part of these three parts is removed from the DNA because they are all integrated like a helix into our cultural DNA. By whatever faith we claim to go by, whatever ideology or belief systems, whatever our lifestyles, whatever our diet, and in my view, these are matters for the individual to decide, not the state, certainly not the police, nor moral police. I'd like to say very frankly that all three are valid. But what have we seen? I'm glad that the Indic Researchers Forum has taken up this kind of issue because the problem we have in India is that we are still studying Indian history as though it is 500 years old, when it is at least 5,000 years old. Now, let us say, for example, that you observe, and I'd like to say that I have immense respect for our opponents on the other side of the Cold War, the Chinese. That's why I spent a lot of time studying them and the Americans, whom, these two countries I've been studying from the 1980s. Somehow, for a long time, people thought I was being a little wrong in my choice of country where studying China was concerned. Today, I don't think anybody does that anymore. But the reality is, I think it was Mao Zedong who said, stand on the tall mountain. And if you stand on a tall mountain and you stand on the pavement, well, or if you stand on the top of the skyscraper, sorry, forget about mountains. We are all in cities. You stand on the top of the skyscraper or stand on the tall mountain, there's a big difference in what you see, what you understand, and your whole outlook. So we have to stand on the skyscraper of 5,000 years of Indic tradition and history. 5,000 years rather than just about 500 years. And that is something which I think is slowly happening. I'm glad it has been taking off in the regime that was inaugurated in 2014, headed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. I'd like to say that it is very important. But again, remember, this has to be done in the context of understanding that all three segments are part of our DNA. The mistake that was made that only these 500 years are the DNA, the other 4,500 years is myth or rubbish, should not be replaced by saying that the final 500 years or the final whatever is 600 or so years was not of the same value as 4,500 years. 4,500 years, obviously, in terms of quantity, in terms of tradition, it is of value. I'd like to end by pointing out, Alexander is celebrated in Greece. Caesar is celebrated in Rome. He's celebrated by every Indian. He's not regarded, Caesar or Alexander are not regarded as religious figures. Alexander, by the way, was Macedonian, which is why the Greeks insisted that the Macedonians call their country not Macedonia. They wanted to ensure that the legacy of Alexander remained Greek. Well, we are given it to Greece. They got a huge tradition of philosophy and conquest under Alexander. But the point of the matter is, the Lord Ram, for example, the Ram Setu. I mean, I have personally experienced, and I do believe, and I think scientific evidence is there, that this is a bridge. Why are we so shy of saying that? Why are we so shy of acknowledging it as a national monument? Why are we so shy of saying that no, these are all myths, these have all been created? I mean, I may be, I don't know, I'm not the most intelligent person on the planet, but I honestly believe Lord Ram existed. I honestly believe that there is a lot from the Vedic period that we can learn, irrespective of whether we're atheists or we believe in one faith or the other. It's of immense value. I have found the Torah. I have found the Old Testament and the New Testament. I have found the Quran of immense value. I would like to say of immense value. I found the Sikh faith to be of immense value. The Jain faith, I mean, I always wonder at my Jain friends, whenever a swarm of mosquitoes comes into my room and I use that bat-like, that tennis racket-like thing to try and finish them off. The Jains, sometimes the Jains are there when I do that. Some Jain friends are there and they're horrified. Well, I mean, thank God they don't seem to be getting malaria. But I'd only like to point out that this is important. 5,000 years of history, not 500, not 4,500. We have to go as a unified culture, a unified nation, a unified people, because that is now absolutely an imperative in this existential conflict. And we have to be clear what side we are on. We have to be very cold-bloodedly realistic about that. We cannot be romantic about that. We cannot be romantic about what countries were 20 years ago, or even some countries 20 months ago, what they are now, because the next 2 or 3 years will determine what happens in India. Do we grab the opportunities that Cold War 2.0 has provided? The manner in which China under Deng Xiaoping grabbed the opportunities of Cold War 1.0, or will we lose them for all time to come? The threats for at least 10, 12 years, we are going to be constantly under threat. It will take at least that long for a decision. I'd like to say, continue by add that I'm not sure about the decision. I think the balance of advantage is on our side, but I still cannot confidently predict that we are going to win because I don't know how many mistakes we are going to make, how many mistakes the other side is going to make, and mistakes besides, and what kind of policies. Because some of the policies I'm seeing in many countries that have to band together are not entirely the best policies for the kind of existential battle we are facing. So I'd like to sign off by once again expressing my gratitude to the Indic Forum for allowing me to open this particular conference with such distinguished participants, with such, if I may say so, brilliant participants. And I'd only like to say, I'm sure all of them realize we are in the battle of our lives. This is 1939, 1945. 1939 didn't begin in 1939. It began in 1929. All the signs were missed, and we had 1939. So that is why I'm saying 10, 12 years. We can't miss the signs once more, as so many countries did in the 20th century. India can't miss the signs. Certainly our country cannot. And it is in that spirit that I encourage you to have this conference. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir. It was truly an insightful start to our conference. Moving on to our first session. In this session, we will talk about India's role and challenges in the Indo-Pacific region. I extend a very warm welcome to the session chair, Lieutenant General Shaukin Chauhan, PVSM, AVSM, YSM, SM, VSM, and PhD. Shaukin Sir was the chairman of the Ceasefire Monitoring Group in August 2018. He was the Director General of Assam Rifles, India's oldest and largest paramilitary force. He has held key appointments during his long career in the army. Sir has served at the apex level in the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Home Counterinsurgency, Counterterrorism, Border Guarding, and Human Resource Management. Sir also has vast experience in military diplomacy since he was the defense attaché in the Indian Embassy in Nepal for 3.5 years. He is also the advisory council member of Indic Researchers Forum. I also welcome the speakers, Commodore S.L. Deshmukh, Senior Vice President of Sun Group's Aerospace and Defense Vertical, Dr. Nanda Kishore, Associate Professor and Head, Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, and Commodore Dr. Johnson Odakal, Navy veteran and internationally certified John Maxwell author, speaker, teacher, trainer, research guide, and growth coach. We are delighted to have you all in our midst today. I now pass on the mic to Lieutenant General Shaukin Chauhan. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Sneha. Thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. It was indeed wonderful to hear my old friend, Professor Nalapat. Uh, and I must say in the beginning that I totally agree with what Professor Nalapat has said, that the dawn of another era, of another another war is almost upon us. President Xi Jinping actually declared in July that those who get in the way of China's ascent will have their heads bashed bloody against the Great Wall of Steel. The People's Liberation Army Navy is churning out ships at a rate not seen since World War II, as Beijing issues threats against Taiwan and the other neighbors. The top American Pentagon officials have warned that China could start a military conflict in the Taiwan Straits or other geographical hotspots sometime this decade. So, Professor Nalapat, you're not just a person who's foreseen the future, you're a person who's linked it to the past and linked it to the period of 1929 to 1939, those 10 years of the ascent of the German war machine, which then created mayhem for the next 6 years. Analysts and officials in Washington are fretting over the worsening tensions between the US and China and the risks to the world of two superpowers once again clashing rather than cooperating. President Joe Biden has said that US is not seeking a new Cold War, and also that the US does not want a change of the world order. But that's the wrong way to look at the US-China relations. A Cold War with Beijing, to my mind, is already on the way. And the right question is whether America can deter China from initiating a hot one. We in India are actually in the hot seat. We are neighbors of China. We have long differences with China about our boundaries. And we cannot close our eyes and we cannot shut our eyes to what is going to happen in the world 10 years or 5 years from now. Beijing is a remarkably ambitious, revanchist power, one that is determined to make China whole again by reuniting Taiwan with the mainland, turning the East and South China Seas into Chinese lakes, and grabbing the regional primacy as a stepping stone to global power. It is also increasingly encircled and faces growing resistance on many fronts, just the type of scenario that has led it to lash out in the past. What is clear is that since the founding of the People's War of China and People's Republic of China in 1949 is, when confronted by a mounting threat to its geopolitical interests, Beijing does not wait to be attacked. It shoots first to gain the advantage of surprise. As the region of the Indo-Pacific has become an area of intense focus due to the changing geopolitical developments and changes in the patterns of war, of power relations between the stakeholders. And to that, in keeping in mind, this discussion on the Indo-Pacific is indeed very timely and very important. And I hope that people take advantage of our discussions, advantage of our conclusions, and use these discussions to further develop the hypothesis on how we should deal with a China that is determined to take her place in the world as the leading power of the world global war order. India's unique maritime position with 7,517 kilometers of a coastline demands intense strategy building to ensure that its maritime as well as national security in general are looked at. And that's the reason why, for this particular discussion, we have two naval officers, very well-known, very distinguished naval officers, who will speak on the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, who will be highlighting the short-term strategies and long-term visions. Commodore Shrikant Deshmukh, our first speaker, Nausena Medal, has served in the Navy for 32 years. His education qualifications are he's a BE Mechanical and MSc Defense Sciences and a gold medalist in his PG diploma course. And he holds a qualification both in marine and aviation fields. He's a specialist in the maintenance of fighter aircraft and anti-submarine warfare. And also was in charge Commodore Superintendent of the Naval Aircraft Yard and Director, Naval Institute of Aeronautical Technology and Project Director of a very major naval aviation project. He's also an alumni of the Defense Services Staff College. Post-retirement from the Indian Navy, the Commodore has worked with the Tata Group for 5 years and currently with the Sun Group's Aerospace and Defense Vertical as the Senior Vice President, Industrial Corporation. After Commodore Deshmukh, we will have Commodore Dr. Odakol Johnson, who will speak after that, since Professor Nanda Kishore is a little busy and would come in only towards the end. I would request the speakers to speak between 15 and 20 minutes and leave a little bit of time so that we can further initiate a discussion or have questions on what they've spoken. Commodore Deshmukh, over to you.
Thank you so much for your kind words. It's an honor and pleasure. I will just get on with the screen. Is the screen visible? Hello?
Yes, it's visible. Go ahead.
Okay. Chairman sir, co-panelists and friends, a very good afternoon. I would like to compliment the Indic Research Forum for organizing this conference on a very important subject and giving me a chance to present views on importance of Andaman and Nicobar Command. The presentation would be covered as shown on the slide. The great Indian strategist Chanakya had said that by being alert, you can keep an eye on every movement of the enemy. As has been brought out, watching China is become very, very critical for India for its stability and maintaining its prestige. These words very aptly signify the role of Andaman and Nicobar Command. As we all know, India currently has multiple problems on its platter to tackle: pandemic effects, Afghanistan, Pakistan and China issues, instabilities in Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean region have a bearing on India's geo-economic, political stability as well as security. Impact of these issues on India's global prestige can be very significant, and the deft handling of the situation has become utmost necessary for India. The task is really arduous because of the limited resources available to India. Though various measures have been initiated to stabilize its economy and tackle situation on various other fronts, a lot more certainly needs to be done if we want to be relevant in IOR. This is where India's Andaman and Nicobar Joint Services Command would play a very vital role. Before we delve into the analyzing factors related to the importance of Andaman Nicobar Command, it would be necessary for us to briefly focus on the current geopolitical scenario in Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. These regions are undoubtedly critical for the security and economic well-being of India. China's hegemonic behavior in Indo-Pacific region in general and in South China Sea in particular, militarization and creation of artificial islands are all detrimental to the freedom of navigation and rule-based order in Indo-Pacific region. It is indisputable that open and inclusive Indo-Pacific region is important for maintaining peace, economic and political stability, safety and security in that area as well as in IOR. In addition, China's illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing activities and surreptitious survey operations in Indian Ocean region also pose a danger to the long-term economic stability and security of India and other littoral countries in the region. As if this wasn't enough, predatory financial investment by China in countries like Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, et al. Have changed the geostrategic calculus in IOR. Further, China's String of Pearls project also has significant implications for India's security. China-Pakistan nexus, as a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, like the Gwadar Port, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor pose their own problems for India. On economic front, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, led by China, has its unique implications for India. In view of the above, it is imperative for India to have a comprehensive strategy to tackle problems faced by China and maintain its importance in Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean region. Andaman and Nicobar Command has an important role to play in this context. Before we move forward, allow me to focus your attention on the comparative military strengths of India and China. It unfortunately doesn't paint a very rosy picture for our country. Thus, we need to do our best in the given scenario, which would lead us to analyze the importance of Andaman Nicobar Command to do much more with the limited resources what we have. Let us first see the brief historical perspective related to the Andaman Nicobar Command. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are among the most strategically located island chains in the world. These islands, forming an important part of Seoul Archipelago in the bay, and which straddle the important sea channels, are critical for India's strategic interest. Being the common maritime space between India and Southeast Asia, the Bay of Bengal, and adjoining Andaman Sea, these are critical for peninsular India's strategic maneuvers. China's unabated efforts to expand its footprint in Indian Ocean region, mainly to overcome its Malacca dilemma, which spells out China's fear of maritime blockade of Straits of Malacca, and to fulfill its maritime Silk Road ambition, have fueled apprehension about economic, navigational, and strategic security aspects in this water for many countries. India's aspirations in the bay thus coexist with its own apprehension over the belligerent rise of China in the region. Consequently, the littoral countries as well as the global powers have sought to engage in security collaboration to ensure free movement along the SLOCs. On this background, strategic location of Andaman and Nicobar Islands makes them well suited to serve as a nodal point in such collaborations. Keeping this perspective in mind, the Andaman and Nicobar Command, or ANC for short, was created in the year 2001 to safeguard India's strategic interests in the Southeast Asia as well as the Strait of Malacca by increasing rapid deployment of the military assets in the region. ANC is the first and the only tri-service theater command as of now of the Indian Armed Forces based at Port Blair in these strategically well-located islands. The Andaman Nicobar Command plays a very critical role in providing logistical and administrative support to naval platforms and other military assets which are sent on deployment to the East Asia and the Pacific Ocean. India has sought to leverage the potential of these islands and enhance capabilities of Andaman and Nicobar to protect its own interest, strengthen its image as a net security facilitator, if not the net security provider in this region, and monitor the shipping routes passing through these islands. The very important functions which are served by Andaman and Nicobar Command cover control over vital global shipping routes. In that, the zone of influence of ANC has a deep significance in terms of history, culture, religion, economy and trade, EEZs, political and international relations, national security, safety and freedom of navigation and power projection of not only India, but also other nations of South Asia and the Southeast Asia, as well as 3 trillion international trade, which passes through the South Andaman Sea, is also significant. ANC's influence over the gateway of Far East includes 6-degree channel and the 10-degree channel in Indian EEZ in the Bay of Bengal, which is connected to the Strait of Malacca. These are crossed by over 94,000 merchant ships every year, carrying world's 40% foreign trade to and from China, South Korea, and Japan. Andaman and Nicobar Islands account for the 0.02% of India's land, but 30% of its exclusive economic zone. It's a very important factor to note. The control over critical shipping checkpoints, since this is an Indian EEZ and ANC's influence zone connects Indian Ocean with South China Sea and the Pacific Ocean, the safety of Malacca Strait is paramount to the economies of the numerous countries. This command also facilitates as a Quad force multiplier. The Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, a strategic dialogue between Australia, India, Japan, and USA, is aimed at countering the risks posed by the trade and the security of navigation and nations in and around this region. Quad nations continue to hold regular military exercises in the ANC's influence area, such as Exercise Malabar. Historic and contemporary geostrategic soft and hard power covers historic Indian cultural influence in the region. The area in and around ANC influence zone is also part of the historic Great India, which was dotted with numerous Indianized Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms. The post-port development-led encirclement strategy covers for enhancing the regional connectivity, trade, safety and security, and to protect the Strait of Malacca Channel. India is developing several strategic ports in influence zone of AMC. They cover Port of Chittagong in Bangladesh with the rail connectivity to Tripura, Port of Mongla in Bangladesh, Sitaway as a part of Kaladan Multimodal Transit Transport Project in Myanmar, Sabanga Deep Sea Project, under India-Indonesia Strategic Military and Economic Partnership, along with India's Sagarmala projects aimed at developing several coastal ports in India. India is also considering developing more ports in influence zone of ANC, such as Dawai Port Project. Finally, the protections of the exclusive economic zone is an important function of the ANC. The region suffers from the problem of piracy. ANC is a guarantor of safety and the security of the exclusive economic zone of India, which also lies in the vicinity of the EEZs of several other nations, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. All these factors point out towards the strategic importance of the ANC. Despite Andaman Nicobar Command's existing capabilities, we still need to do much more to protect our own national interest. Thus, in coming years, India would surely need to do, firstly, re-evaluate its current policy to factor in China's unilateral approach and the growing strategic objectives in the Indian Ocean region. Secondly, recalibrate its response to China because of the factors like China's scant regard for India's sensitivity in the regional geopolitics, despite India's self-restraint with regard to granting access to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Secondly, China's growing presence in the Bay of Bengal and its strategic engagement with Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, which has significantly enhanced in the recent years. And lastly, violation of the EEZ around the Andaman Nicobar Island by Chinese research vessel, illustrating China's growing strategic presence and the intentions in the Bay of Bengal, which probably don't behave very well for our strategic well-being. It would also be important for India to develop a comprehensive maritime domain awareness, what is commonly known as MDA, for acquiring granular and accurate knowledge of both the surface and the subsurface actors in the region. This has become critical with China's growing economic and the strategic interest and the commensurate naval presence in IOR, including regular forays by Chinese nuclear submarines in the area. India also needs to make full use of effective increase in the operational range by almost 750 nautical miles and make Andaman and Nicobar a base capable of multi-domain 24/7 operations. India needs to improve the network-centric capabilities of Andaman Nicobar Command to cater for use of new technologies like artificial intelligence as well as EW, that is electronic warfare applications. It's important for India to make Andaman and Nicobar Command as ideal secondary base for IFC, DFC, as well as develop Andaman Nicobar Command as credible center for SAR, search and rescue, IUU control, pollution control, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. In addition to above, India needs to develop Andaman and Nicobar Command as an effective part of the larger Sagarmala initiative. Firstly, to become a credible net-centric facilitator and the first responder. Secondly, to support ASEAN countries in controlling the dragon's menace. And thirdly, bolster the blue economy in the region by supporting renewable energy projects, monitored fishing, and monitored exploitation of the sea wealth in the region. It is sincerely hoped that above initiatives would make India a great power to reckon with in the region and a power to depend on in the Indo-Pacific and Indian Ocean regions. In conclusion, I would like to say India must accord due weightage to the strategic location, which makes Andaman and Nicobar Islands a natural platform for collaboration between India and the Southeast Asia. Display strong political and strategic will to make Andaman and Nicobar Command a credible deterrence force for the enemy and a center of cooperation for the friendly countries. India certainly needs to remove the palpable ambiguity about its ambition and allocate high priority to improving communication and other operational facilities to truly make Andaman and Nicobar India's strategic node in the Indo-Pacific, which signifies the critical importance of Andaman Nicobar Command for India, neighboring countries, and the world as a whole. We as a group have always done our bit to continue to strive for supporting not only the Indian armed forces, but India's Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, and will be playing our role, continue to play our role in strengthening even Andaman Nicobar Command. Thank you and Jai Hind. Thank you, sir.
Shaukin sir, you are on mute.
So we can't hear you, sir.
General sir, we can't hear you.
Sir, we can't hear you, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Commodore Deshmukh, for an excellent presentation. I totally agree with you that India needs to do much more to make sure that our assets are EEZ, and the fact that China has been trying to encircle us through a string of pearls policy. We need to strengthen our Andaman Nicobar Command. We need to strengthen so many more things. But more important is that we need to strengthen our response to China's aggressive capabilities in the Indo-Pacific region. I now will request Commodore Odakal Johnson. He is a naval veteran and internationally certified John Maxwell author. He's also a speaker, teacher, trainer, research guide, and growth coach. His professional seafaring journey commenced in 1982 aboard training ship Rajendra 39 years ago, and he served the Navy for the last 34 years, with his final assignment being Director, Maritime History Society from 2015 to 2021. He's authored the book Timeless Wake, The Legacy of the Royal Indian Navy in World War II, in addition to many scholarly works. He has a PhD in civics and politics from the University of Mumbai, in addition to MPhil and 2 MSc degrees. Commodore Johnson forte is to jumpstart effective growth solutions, enhance knowledge, influence, and envision live navigation in the maritime academic strategic space. We're indeed lucky to have Commodore Johnson to speak to us. May I request Commodore Johnson to please go ahead with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, General. I'll just wait. Yeah. So by the time I am trying to set up my screen and uh, yeah, shift to my presentation, I suppose this is seen now.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay, great. So one of the challenges will be I will not be able to hear. So may I request you, sir, or one of the organizers, if there's any challenge, I'll just follow through on my presentation. So
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'm honored, General Chauhan, very honored to be on the same panel as mentored by you, and was delighted to hear Professor Madhav's uh, opening talk also. My qualification to do this is very interesting. If any of my school teachers knew that I would be talking about history, any kind of history, let alone maritime history, I'm sure some of them will come charging back and just test my credentials a bit. But then, courtesy the Indian Armed Forces, they make you an expert at many things you may otherwise consider you are not. So I will take benefit of that, and with the current journey. So let me begin addressing the primary audience that I am talking to, which is a bunch of young enthusiasts, researchers, people interested in policy making, geopolitics, and the phraseology I'm using is called global maritime thought. And yet, I'm not going to remain on the maritime geopolitics, but using my last experience, I'm going to go forward into Indian maritime history and a short summary of the naval journey right at the end. So, this is what I will talk of, and I purposely have put this word maritime in brackets, Indo-Pacific canvas, which any understanding of geography will call it maritime. So a brief talk on the early Indian Ocean. I will take a few examples, West and East, one mention of West and the East, then some context of the Chola expedition in 1043, talk on the Malabar Might, the Maratha armor, and then how the timelessness of India's naval journey makes the difference. Now, this is a visual that is inspired by late Admiral Jayant Natkarni, who was sharing the story about, 100 million years ago, India started its first maritime journey. And that is this whole idea of Laurasia and Gondwana. And the process continued when the Indian subcontinent actually made a seafaring journey from Africa to crash into the Eurasian plate. So Admiral Natkarni used to say, we began a maritime journey even before we were geographically formed. But maybe there wasn't sufficient maritime perspective into our mindsets. So there is this one line in my book I wrote which says, in many other countries, people go to the seaside to sail, swim, or surf. We go to Chapati to have pani puri. Okay, which is okay. I mean, it's good to have, it's a good snack, but that's the kind of context. Sometimes a bit more of maritime consciousness will make a difference. But Professor Madhav talked about 5,000 years. And so what happened? More than 5,000 years ago, once the Indian geographical landmass had got formed, the weather changes meant sea levels changed, and across to the west, the prominent location or landmark is today the government is developing the National Maritime Heritage Complex at Lothal, which is very different from where actual Lothal was. But then some things you have to locate conveniently, about nearly 80 kilometers away from Gandhinagar. And it is not the geography of today. It was actually, the sea was in there, and that kind of indicates our connectivity to the West. But I'm not going to linger more. I'm going to be very mindful of the time. This is the visual that I want to talk about. Who's talking about Indo-Pacific today in the 20th, 21st century? This is India's connectivity to the East, Southeast, Far East. I wish I had 3 hours to just talk on this one map. And maybe in future I will. Okay, how is this relevant? The Bay of Bengal used to be called Magh Kaling, based on the sea which was to the east, or today the Bay of Bengal. And Kaling, Indians were called Klings in much of Southeast Asia. And I had done a bit of climatological studies, and very interestingly, today is the 13th, and on 19th of November will be Kartik Purnima. And on Kartik Purnima, subject to what the Odisha government will allow, you will find these scenes, the one on the right, a festival called Boita Bandhana, which is when young women, teens, unmarried young women, or in general now anyone, they don't take, of course, these kind of boats. They'll take plantain leaves and put a little bit of a lamp and go to any water body. But the original idea was that that was the day when the monsoon would change from the southwest monsoon to the northeast monsoon. And that is when the seafarers from Kaling set sail from there. And if these small boats that are being put as a festival celebration, if they had the seafaring ability, something like the visual representation by the Amar Chitrakatha comics, we had done some work with them, then the boat would actually reach Bali Island in Indonesia. So both cultural evidence, and do you know the time frame in which it would reach Bali? There is a festival in Bali at the same time. So cultural connectivity talks, and today stands witness, even today in a practice, that we were connected across. So from there, let me jump some 10 centuries. And there has been this standard narrative that exists that, you know, India is a very pacifist country, and others have come and attacked us, and we have never launched expeditions. Now, you need to know maritime history to know that that statement is not true. But there is a context to an expedition. What is the context? India had a thriving maritime trade that went across to west, to the east, and to the southwest. Because Gujarat was connected to East Africa, Malabar was connected to the Red Sea, the entirety of the East Coast was connected to East and Southeast. There have been enough talks. And around the time of the Chola Empire, do you know, we talk of Malacca dilemma today in a different context. That entire region of Malacca and Singapore was famous for piracy. It was a family business. Now, a little bit of piracy was okay. But when the basic freedom of sea trade started getting affected, then Rajendra Chola had to intervene. And that is the context in which he sends a complete expedition, and that creates mayhem, and in the process restores freedom of sea. So freedom of sea, when the Indian Navy started in 2008 anti-piracy operations, we were just carrying forward a legacy that India has always stood for freedom of navigation and freedom of sea. It's not a US strategy of FONOPS that happens in South China Sea and something. It is something which was very endemic to our own thought process. So that is the Chola legacy across the Indo-Pacific. And with what today is ASEAN, as I said, again, as I said, it's just to trigger your thought that we did this, we restored the context. So even before I come to the second millennia of the Common Era, Indian Ocean region through time and beyond, which today is Indo-Pacific, was represented by these three seas. A cultural infusion across the region. Commerce was the primary driver, and so connectivity happened across the seas. Oceans unite. I can go on telling you stories. I love telling stories, but you know about connectivity, and I'm myself writing a book which is talking about connectivity. This represented. What you will miss in this is military threat or contestation and conflict in a significant manner was missing in this region till much later. So let's go to the next part. Now, this is 2020 to us in Kerala. You know, Mohanlal is called Laletan. He's a very famous, actor. And by the way, both Mammootty and Mohanlal have now represented Kunjali Marakar. So that's why I put the poster just to, lighten the thing. But this is, everyone talks of colonization in 20th May 1498. This is an artist depiction of Vasco da Gama, long story, lands up in front of Samudri, the Nair Hindu chieftain of Kozhikode. And that whole journey of he wanting to have exclusive trading rights. You know what was Calicut of the 15th century? It was modern free trade zone. And it was a cosmopolitan environment where people from every region, language, tribe were present. And there was a genuine sense of maritime integration across the place. I call it the Malabar legacy. So it's not unusual that the exercise which the India, Japan, US and Australia have, the Malabar exercise, it's a true legacy. But because it was not allowed, Vasco sails out, he connects with Kochi, and there follows a couple of decades of Portuguese brutality at sea. And there's this big battle of Calicut in 1503, and in which was the beginning of a century-long battle. For your information, I'll come to the next slide. For 100 years, the Portuguese could not make an inroad into the Malabar coast. 1507, Battle of Chaul, great thing to study. Diu, Battle of Diu, 1509, of course, the Pars did not get through. Finally, the Zamorin allows and Ponani, and there's a fort at Chaliam. So the Portuguese are given a little bit of thing. Then these four heroes, Muhammad Kunjali, called Kunjali Marakar, Kutti Pokareli, Kunjali Marakar II, ruled for a very long time, not ruled, Pattu Marakar, Kunjali Marakar III, and Muhammad Marakar, Kunjali Marakar IV. Who were they? Okay, Marakar itself will take a long definition. They were originally merchantmen from Kochi who had moved to the north, and when Calicut or Kozhikode was threatened, they offered to the Zamorin an ability to create a naval force. And from 1524 onwards, they made life miserable for the Portuguese, not letting them infuse into it. I recently at the Naval War College spent almost an hour and a half just going through much of what they did. What is very important is the ending. Kunjali Marakar IV, by the time he comes on par, the Zamorin has had enough. He felt that it was important to collaborate with the Portuguese, and Zamorin goes against his own military. Now, if that sounds a little familiar to some people from military and strategic fields, and I'm going to give another example. Finally, he betrays. Kunjali Marakar IV is captured. He's taken to Goa. He's quartered into 4 parts, and that was demonstrated. And the story of Marakars comes to an end. It would take another nearly 100 years before the Marakar legacy gets restored. And then the story of the Maratha armor. And Maratha armor, some things call it interesting. Let me just go forward. This is Konkan or Deccan region. And I purposely put these two visuals to give you the diversity of topography, from a plateau to a mount to a valley to the sea to beautiful corals. It is one of the geographically diverse and rich regions of the country. And into this region comes the grand Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, who had the vision to look to the sea. Either he built a fort, he repaired a fort, or he constructed a fort. And even in his early days, he had this vision that there is a requirement to build maritime trade and maritime components. So by the time his coronation happens towards the end of the 17th century, the thought processes of having navy are already sown. But he is not the one who finally did it. And in this, there are two. The whole story of Janjira, which is not related to Maratha, in Janjira are the Siddhis who came from Abyssinia or East Africa, became Indians, and they could not be unseated for nearly 200 years. And Suvarnadurga is the place where finally the Sarkhel, or the admiral of the Maratha Navy, Kanhoji Angre. I know the 10th descendant, Sarkhel Raghuraja Angre, is in Alibag, good friend, and so we've shared a lot of stories. So Suvarnadurga becomes a symbol of resistance, and he made life absolutely miserable for the Englishmen. So correction, you must know that many people make this error that Shivaji and Angre were at the same time. They were separated by 80 years. So that was the component. Vijayadurg became the naval base. What was unique? There were these boats called the Gurabs and the Galvats. And Angres had complete coastal dominance from Savantwadi, which is very close to Goa, all the way to Raigad. They even captured the British vessels and Dutch vessels, and the English had no choice but to call Angre a pirate, because there was no other way they could get this thing. With that, I'm going to pause that story and jump forward. Finally, we know by 18th century, the Brits had finally defeated French after nearly 100 years of conflict, mainly in the Bay of Bengal, and finally they are in rulership. So these are two images on the west and the east. The Fort George, which is Mumbai Harbour, and the fortress there, and Fort William, which is Calcutta Harbour, and comes to the end of 18th century, and the English are in complete dominance. And that remains our reality for nearly 200 years. And after that comes one time slot, and that is what, because it's historical, I'm not going to cover too much of contemporary. India was at war. Now, many people say India constitutionally did not exist, but Indians took part in World War II. And I have in this old map put where all were Indians operating from the naval point of view. If I go to the Army story and the Air Force story, it's much wider. We were operating in the North Atlantic, in the Persian Gulf, in the Mediterranean. In Mediterranean, one of the naval ships was in charge of the anti-submarine force. Red Sea, East Africa, a major operation in Madagascar, South Indian Ocean, or South Central Indian Ocean was the story of Bengal. Andamans, both the Japanese attack and the recapture, Arakan in Burma. Why is this important? Even the British didn't want the Navy to develop. They felt there was no requirement of a complete independent Navy for the region of India. But there were a few people who allowed, and so when war happened, suddenly there was a rapid growth of Navy. Why is it important to our talk today into India? The people who are young pioneers like Admiral Katari, Soman, Y.K. Singh, and many other people, Adhar Chatterjee, they saw the activity which is across global maritime theater, and that enabled them to be pioneers today. And so I come to my last two slides. What does it make a difference? Recently on 11th and 12th November, we had the Goa Maritime Conclave, in which the Foreign Secretary and the Defense Secretary were there. And this is from the Foreign Secretary's talk, the first two bullets. He said the summary of Indian maritime power today is sea power is central to progress. And sea power is not only military. It is the ability to use the sea to maximum benefit. Blue economy is at the focus of the government. And the third is a bullet, which is the naval chief mentioned, and many of the chiefs together spoke about it, is collaborative competence. And I want to say collaborative maritime competence. This is the future of the Indo-Pacific. While military power and strategic thought remains the main interest of most of the audience, let me say, if you do not build collaborative competence and you don't strengthen the countries that are with you, not one country, you're not going to take on China or anyone else. And I want to close with this. This is my last slide, because this is for the young researchers. So what do you do next? All this gyan is great. So I have just 3 points for you. Focus on growth. twofold growth. Grow yourself and grow your organization. And growth means you're not satisfied with what you know today, what you are today, develop. And that's why I have focused my life to be a growth coach. Knowledge influence. Why do we want to do research? Because we are not satisfied with the body of knowledge that exists today. I want to probe, like a professor said, new hypotheses, new understandings, reinterpretations, revisions. Okay, so that I can exercise and influence based on my knowledge through me and through me to others. And last is, as a mariner, I have to say, sea has many life lessons. Look at the seascape. It is so diverse, so vast, and that is the future that I have for us. So that is all that I had to share. Let me stop presenting and I will hand back to the moderators.
Thank you, Commodore Johnson. Indeed, an excellent presentation, and really intrigued by the historical research that you have done to ensure that we have this knowledge. Indeed, India has been a great maritime power in the past. There's so much we forget and so much we want to forget, unfortunately, and that's the reason for our lack of understanding of the problems that exist and how to counter the new problem that comes and that will come in the future. It's very important. Those who forget the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. And I really thank you for this excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Now we come to, I see Professor Nanda Kishore there. I will now request Professor Nanda Kishore to speak on his topic. He is an associate professor, head of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, and coordinator of the Center for Polish and Central European Studies, the Manipal Academy of Higher Education in Manipal. He holds an MPhil and a PhD from political science from the Hyderabad Central University, and has completed his postdoctorate from the University of Leiden, Netherlands, with the Erasmus Mundus Fellowship from the European Union. Professor Kishore has been working on conflict resolution, West Asia, refugees, and international law. He is also a recipient of the short-term junior research fellowship from the UNHCR, Brookings, and from the government of Finland. He is a senior fellow of the DRAS in India, analyst of the Islamic theology and of counterterrorism, London, and a visiting fellow to the AIDIA. Professor Nanda Kishore, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Hope all of you are able to see my screen.
Yeah, I can see
Yes,
it.
sir.
I can see it.
Okay, I'll just make it full screen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I think very enriching session so far. Thanks to all my co-panelists and to Yashas for such a brave initiative and bringing veterans, bringing people from all walks of life and all those people who are involved in Indic research. My presentation is much more academic in nature because that's our job. And those of them who are practitioners have given their peace of mind, which is of great help to those of us who work on these fronts. But nevertheless, I'll try making my submission to the very, very given topic to me. That's the challenges to India's Indo-Pacific strategy, which I've titled as India and Indo-Pacific Interest Strategy and the Challenge itself. Now, this is the format of the presentation. Just going into, because we study and we are students of geopolitics, we click on to very, very important individuals like Mahan, Mackinder, Karl Hochschild, and all those people. So I probably may begin with a geopolitician and then probably end also with a scholar on geopolitics. Now, Mahan says that the organization and concentration of force is a factor in the maintenance of justice, order, and peace. It is the highest expression of that element in civilization force that was created and now upholds society, giving efficacy to the pronouncements of law, whether by the legislatures or in the courts. Organized force alone, he says, enables the quiet and the weak to go about their business and to sleep securely in their beds, safe from the violent without or within. So at the end, the last three lines are very, very important. He says that the organized force alone enables the quiet and the weak to go about their business. So Indo-Pacific is all about this for me. And if anybody wants to make their say or have their footprint, I think Mahan is the guide that we can see here. Now, simple introduction to it, how the whole idea of Indo-Pacific has come in. We started off with nothing, and then the oceans were divided, and then we started giving names. And at the same time, certain geographies have become very, very important. Do we call that as revenge of geography? We need to see it. At the end of the Cold War, when the onset of globalization, the way it took off, though it came in the 70s, most of the people thought that the world is going to be a complete different one, where they thought geography will be irrelevant. We will have a world that's going to be absolutely open, and neoliberalism or business alone would take the countries forward. Everybody would be concerned only about wealth, and that creation of wealth in proportionately leading to the national interests of each country. But fortunately or unfortunately, we can see the revenge of geography. Again, it is trying to show its position, that how important it is, and in one or the other way, we've been recreating them. These are in the minds of the people, which we will see whether we call it as revenge of geography, relevance or resurgence of geography, or relevance to geography. It's all left to us. With that enlightened liberal order that we are trying to look at, geographical rivalries among the great powers is going to be the fact of the day. That's precisely why we, in the 21st century, in 2021, when we are going through so many other issues, including that of a pandemic, yet we are talking about a particular region and the geopolitical rivalry, precisely because of this particular problem. Now, understanding the Indo-Pacific is not some sort of a new creation. We see this one because it's sort of a rediscovery. I said that I'll be using quite a few geopolitical theorists. Karl Haushofer once called it by this particular name, Indo-Pacifician ROM, where indirectly what he said is Indo-Pacific region, or the space, in his geopolitical ruminations in the 1920s and the 30s. In fact, he goes on saying that the geographic impact of the dense Indo-Pacific concentration of humanity and cultural empire of India and China, which are geographically sheltered behind the protective veil of the offshore island arcs of the Western Pacific and the Bay of Bengal, offshore island arcs through which they are now both actively and competitively deploying. This is something that he has already spoken about. So what we are doing is rediscovery. If somebody is fooling themselves that they have created a new terminology or it's all going to be new, I think we just are repeating the history that was spoken about. Now, these maritime waters are what another geopolitical strategist, Nicholas Spikeman, considered in 1944 as the circumferential maritime highway, which links the whole area together in terms of sea part. See, this is something that the scholars of geopolitics have done invariably to show that this will come back to us. That's precisely why I use the terminology revenge of geography. Now, why states and diplomats indulge in creating these new spheres? This is something that we also have to look at. Rory Metcalf, many of you must have read his works, have been extremely influential, says that the mental maps of regions and that leaders and the diplomats use have material effects. Again, going back to looking at how resources become very, very important. Now, these maps help define where nations prioritize their diplomatic attentions, the power projection capabilities they develop for their militaries, the strategic problems they must attend to or can afford to ignore, the partners and rivals they identify, and the regional organizations they prefer, including the lists of who's in and who's out. I think these are the ways the regions have been created. For the regions to run, you have certain organizations being created, certain groupings being created. That includes Quad, what we say, AUKUS. You have so many different groups that have been created, and those who have power, those who have capability will stay, and those of them who cannot, and those of them who don't have these great power ambitions will absolutely stay out, is the submission here. Now, how do we deconstruct the Indo-Pacific construct itself? What is the premise? I use the premise, the trigger, and what stops the war. There is no possibility of a war at this juncture, which probably at some point of time in the 2018 and 19s, including Graham Allison, who spoke about the Thucydides trap, almost spoke about that there is something that's coming in, anticipate, there's going to be a war, but it's not going to be, is my take here. What is the premise? The uneasiness of the existing superpower to accommodate a newer power challenging its status has been observed in international politics, which is normal, except for the Second World War, where two the then superpower and contesting superpower both cooperated because of a common enemy, which also in geopolitics and war and strategy we call as the center of gravity, that was Mr. Hitler. Apart from that one, there was no possibility. Otherwise, if you look at time immemorial, every time when a superpower was upset or when the superpower was replaced, and that had happened through friction, that has also led to wars and many other things. What are the triggers then in that case? The comprehensive national power of China and the US uneasiness are equally going together, because China wants to call its rise as peaceful rise, which we remember, and the Chinese dream. Again, it's a very, very elusive terminology that's been used by several leaders. There are two terminologies that the Chinese use.
Professor Nandakishore, if I can just interrupt, your slides are not moving ahead.
You're unable to see the slide?
Only now we can.
It's
now
now appearing?
Yeah, now they've started appearing.
Okay, fine. When I think,
but they were not moving ahead, so you would need to sort of press on them.
Is it fine now?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, so these two terminologies, use of force and harmony, have their own distinct features in the Chinese construct itself. Because we look at the Ming Emperor, he also sent across his Admiral Zheng, where he mentioned this harmony as a terminology, but over a period of time, we have seen how this has been interpreted in different ways. Now, what stops the war? Advent of nuclear weapons, no doubt about it. The complex interdependence that we speak in international relations, where economic relations have bound a lot of these nations, irrespective of the type of uneasiness that they go through, and then hurt the adversary economically. Now, that's the only way you can do, not any other possibilities at this juncture. That also has to be respected. Hope you're able to see the next slide.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So there are certain Chinese slogans. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but these are very, very important ones today. If Indo-Pacific is a problematic scenario where there are a lot of challenges that all of us are going through, or the countries are going through, from a superpower to emerging powers to great powers, it's all because of these typical statements. Now, theory of the three represents advanced productive forces, advanced culture and interests of the broad masses, and finally the relative prosperous society is what Jiang Zemin said. So they have already given them what they have to achieve. Harmonious society and the scientific concept of development, this was spoken by Hu Jintao. Then moderately prosperous society by 21, global technology leader by 35, strong democratic civilized harmonious, though all sound rhetoric. This was by Xi Jinping. He is given a target of 2049. Now, all this is culminating in what we see as the Belt and Road Initiative. That's the philosophical foundation in which they are not ready to agree what India is doing in the Indo-Pacific itself. Now, India's interests are very, very clear. We all started off with the confluence of the two C's speech by Shinzo Abe in Indian Parliament in 2007. Perhaps that's when India started talking about it. India created the Indo-Pacific division within the MEA, and we also have the Indian Ocean Rim Association, ASEAN, and the Quad, several other ones trying to integrate all the words. Now, border dispute with China, in fact, has triggered a lot of other things. Why Indian strategic communities actually become very, very vocal, and it says now openly you are seeing, including my own guru, Professor M.D. Nalapat, who spoke about China as an aggressor. He's speaking China as a rival for India, is all because of this particular component where unapologetically they have been then trying to do something or the other to upset India and see to it that India is restricted to its own region, not even the region, even they're trying to cover us, they're trying to trouble us in our own region, forget going up till the Indo-Pacific. But what is the change that has come in? What is the strategy that has come in? There is an unapologetic realist that has come into India's foreign policy itself. Perhaps an unavoidable one, no doubt about it, because India debates on balancing and alliance formation, they are undergoing a lot of changes. Though India is allergic to the word alliance, I think that's all coming in these days. Now, India needs to manage that. When we look at the type of challenges and the issues that are existing, it needs to manage itself in a conflict between an advancing power, that is China, and an already advanced power or a dominating power. This is what we call as the disruption of the status quo that's happening. And India is in between, because the United States want to see India as a linchpin, and it wants India to join in and come out of this reluctant power approach that we are able to see, where it's not ready to call out India as an enemy, China as an enemy, and then trying to take part and move the Quad. It's much more protective, and somehow we see India going comparatively or trying to take a softer approach. The maritime initiatives I already mentioned about the BIMSTEC, IORA, and all those things need to be strengthened. Somehow, institutional strength is much better than individual capacity to deal with a particular nation. This is seen even with the superpower. United States is unable to do anything with regard to China. Now, what are the probabilities and the opportunities? Now, heightened neoliberal approach is the need of the hour. As security-related issues will put India in the backbench. India certainly cannot compete at this juncture. That's why I said institutional strengthening is important. There are a lot of them who have complex interdependence with China. And if India has to succeed in the Indo-Pacific, it needs to somehow put the neoliberal approach. It needs to economically interact with and integrate the region to make sure that there is a primacy of the Indian Ocean, and that Indian Ocean is only being extended through the Indo-Pacific. Now, we have also arrived at a situation, whether you want to choose globalization or not, globalization has chosen you already without your own consent. Now, that's a scenario, and we need to get into that pragmatic approach. That's a possibility. Now, use of IR theory, just for the sake of young audience, there are also a lot of students who are looking up to. These are classic, very important theories. If you look at neorealism as well as neorealism as well as realism, who talk about anarchy, pursuing the national interest is not is immoral. They say this is beyond all those things. There is also some amount of relative gain for US and Japan, whereas absolute gain is for India and Australia, but they need to make that. This is what the theoretical approach anticipates India to take forward. But there is going to be an idea of the collective security alliance. Where is it leading to? That's a question that we need to look at. Is there a balance of power or a balance of threat? That clarity has to come to some of these nations. Now, US and Japan have military ambitions, whereas India and Australia have commercial ambitions. That's why Quad is still in a desire. It's in a bad condition. It's unable to make any progress whatsoever. Then you have the neoliberal institutionalism, which also believes in anarchy, state as rational actors, and it wants to think national interest is in terms of it's in terms of the wealth that the states have to create, standard of living, all those things. It's important. Cooperation is not harmony. This is what they say. Cooperation is not equivalent or synonym to harmony. Cooperation is possible when there is a conflict alone. Only so they anticipate that can be taken care of. Now, harmony is the absence of all conflict, which is absolutely impossible. They are much more pragmatic in this approach. Their problem, or when we interpret through this particular theoretical framework, there are no institutions. That's another difficulty here. No plan drawn so far, and trade and commerce as a focus is yet to come into this region. It's still seen as some sort of a security construct. There is a problem with regard to that. Only perhaps the social constructivists have a different type of an understanding, because they argue that states can have multiple identities that are socially constructed through interaction with other actors. The practicing democracies is what they say. Security diamond is Japan. Then Australia feels itself as non-entrepreneur, that it can be there in all possible ways, because Australia was reluctant till recently to speak against China. Now slowly it's opening up. What are the parameters that we are trying to look at? Quality of democracy. Over a period of time in all these nations, invariably people are talking that quality of democracy is not actually going the way we are anticipating. Do we expect ASEAN to pitch in all those things as an idea to do something? I don't think they are so formidable that they can take on China just like that. There is also democratic deficit in those people, with those people whom we are trying to partner. They want to establish democracy by trying to bring something else. That's a problem. Now, between 2000 to 2015, this is an interesting study that says democracy broke down inside 27 countries. This is from Larry Diamond's work. But Quad thinks that democracy is what has brought us together. I don't know, will that ever be an answer in the Indo-Pacific as a challenge? Now, what is the limitation of the strategy? There is a leadership crisis. Each one of them are towering leaders, but as such, what the word leadership means is still in crisis. There is an institutional crisis where as institutions are unable to pitch into it and then stand formidably against China and then make use of the best possible components of Indo-Pacific itself. There is an action plan issue. There is an action plan deficit crisis, which we have to recognize. I think being pragmatic, we need to recognize that particular component as well, which is also very, very crucial for us to understand. If these three are taken care, I think these limitations can be taken care of. Now, what I'm anticipating at the end is some sort of preparedness that is always required. through partnerships and then promotion of a networked region. Without that, individually, I think all these countries are heroes, but collectively they have a lot of problems. Individually also, if they're heroes, they can show what is their strength and power, but they're unable to deliver anything. For these three things to happen, there is an amount of consistency that is required in the approach that the countries are following. That includes India. I'm specifically referring to Quad and other things. Cooperation, constant cooperation is required, and then they need to create conducive opportunities for all of them to feel they are important, all of them to take up responsibility. I mentioned in the beginning itself, as I promised, I start with the geopolitical theorist and also would end. Hoshafar had actually anticipated what's happening in the Indo-Pacific. He said, if an empire could arise with Japan's soul in China's body, that would be a power which would put even the empire of Russia and the United States in the shade. This is what Karl Hoshafar had said. I think that is exactly what has happened. I think including India, United States, and all like-minded powers have to deal with this reality in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you for your patient listening. Thank you to the organizers as well as the chair. I will stop it here.
Thank you, Dr. Nand Kishore, indeed for an excellent presentation. The entire Eastern Theater Command of the Chinese military is actually aimed at Taiwan and Japan. And its army continue to enhance its readiness to prevent Taiwan independence and execute an invasion if necessary. So we have to be very clear that China has the capability. What has to change, what changes is the intent, and China seems to be changing that intent, moving very quickly towards a confrontation. I've always believed that Beijing would like to avoid military confrontation over Taiwan. But Beijing has never taken the military card off the table. And the pace of China's military developments has far exceeded Taiwan's, and the balance is clearly tilted in the favor of China. Even in the several scenarios where the United States would intervene in a cross-strait conflict. So thank you for such an interesting presentation, Dr. Nand Kishore, Commodore Deshmukh and Commodore Johnson. We've had a very interesting time. We now have very little time for a few questions, but I'll take a question each for each one of you. Do we have the questions, Yashat?
Yes, sir, it is there in the chat box.
Okay. So the question is, a foregrounding of non-traditional security challenges in the diplomatic agenda is the right way as this approach provides the scope to enlarge India's maritime footprint consonant with the civilizational vision of the leaders of India's freedom struggle. What is your take on the statement, Commodore Johnson? Could I have your views?
Thank you, General. I will try and succinctly take extents from the question, very well framed. Approach. While I covered a lot of things on history, my take is maritime history and its study gives us a database of what has been to chart a strategy for the future. So in that sense, when the question says non-traditional security challenges in the diplomatic agenda, I will kind of rephrase it. The military component or the power interaction is just one of the options available to build your influence and maritime might. Even in the Quad, while there is possibility and has come that we feel that they haven't done enough, but if by choice they have taken collaborating for vaccines and pandemic and addressing the pandemic, it is a comfortable place to start, for which you will need all the resources, including the military resources. Like when Vaccine Maitri happened last year, the policy was taken from the health and protection, but the tools used were military tools, whether it was the Air Force transport aircraft or whether it was the ships. And that is exactly what the maritime domain provides. It is never unidimensional, or there's a new phrase called mini-dimensional. It is always multi-dimensional. So this is India's strength. And we have interactions. In popular narrative, you have the regular Quad and you have the Middle Asian, your West Asian Quad, and we can have all the alphabet soups going on. But the truth is, not just the freedom struggle. I think, strategic thought from ancient India, some of the medieval India, or even the pre-modern idea of maritime collaboration, which is reflected in the evolving policy, is maritime partnerships and collaborative growth is the way where we can build ourselves. So in short answer is yes, there is no other option. The threat to the planet today is not from military threat, but climate, and those challenges are so great that India's might came to fore in 2004 when we addressed the tsunami and other components and the responses to that. So that is the way forward. And along with that, for a military action that evolves, that unfortunately comes our way, I'm sure we will not be found wanting. So answer is yes, we have always stood for freedom of the maritime space, and we continue to do that through all means possible, including military.
Well said, Commodore Johnson. Well said. I agree with that. We must continue to extend our area of influence by doing whatever we can, and non-military threats emerge through such issues like the pandemic, or an earthquake, or or a tsunami. So I totally agree with you that we must continue to do what we're doing, because that will help us finally form alliances with like-minded countries. And as you said, democratic countries eventually hold the edge over countries like China. Professor Commodore Deshmukh, there's a question for you. What is the cost-benefit analysis of guarding the Andaman and Nicobar Islands from foreign invaders or any other entities? What do you feel are the issues involved, and where are we going wrong and not helping out, or not doing what you feel we should be doing?
Thank you, General Sir. Let me break down this question in three distinct parts. First of all, when we do the cost-benefit analysis, my angle onto it, the national security and national well-being cannot be termed into the cost-benefit analysis as such. If you have to do a thing, we have to do a thing. If nation is there, then the nationals, then only everything else will be there. So national security is absolutely paramount. Today, we have to focus onto the strategic location of the Andaman Nicobar Islands, pretty much near to Indonesia and other littoral countries in that region. Therefore, the bilateral cooperation between these countries, focusing on their individual capabilities. Suppose Indonesia is stronger in the patrolling, give that particular component to them. Have a bilateral component of patrolling to Indonesia, so that Indian assets then could be deployed for other strategic requirements. That is absolutely critical for us. Secondly, we have to focus on to the littoral countries as a whole, because if we let go the blue economy angle out of this and keep it only a military angle, that's the biggest mistake we will ever commit. And China is actually waiting for us to commit that mistake. Because if the fisheries are allowed to be exploited like China is doing, by thousands and thousands of fishing vessels being deployed in the region, the economy of all littoral countries will go down, and the debt trap which has been led by China will absolutely kill the total littoral economy in this region. We cannot allow that to happen. Then coming back, why hasn't it paid its dividend and all that? We have to really appreciate and understand the maritime domain knowledge and its importance has started taking its roots not very long ago. There were thought process that probably Navy is not needed at all, despite having the strong naval history and the naval background to ourselves. So that neglect has landed us into the situation where we are, that we need much more than what we have. But yes, what we need to do today is be very, very critical about utilizing the assets what we have. For example, if you want to thwart China, instead of building the huge capacity for them, you should have the strategic fishing fleet. When the survey vessel of China comes around Andaman Nicobar, let go of your 200 fishing boats in and around the Chinese ship, and you are in your own water. They cannot be threatened. It's the biggest nuisance you will cause through a survey. Secondly, what we haven't learned yet and we need to develop is the deployment of drones, and that too underwater drones by China in and around Bay of Bengal, Indian Ocean region, especially near Andaman and Nicobar. We will have to have the capability to locate these drones and capture and destroy these drones if required. So this is what we are lacking, and has been brought out by the speakers. A collaborative approach is very much important. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you, General Sir.
Thank you, Commodore Deshmukh. We have time for just one more question, and I'll request Dr. Nand Kishore to please answer this. A nation with India's maritime assets, challenges and opportunities needs a multidisciplinary maritime advisory body to conceptualize a vision, draw plans, and monitor activities in the maritime domain. Dr. Nand Kishore, what do you feel about this?
Yes, sir. I think it's spot on. I think it's more like a comment I would take rather than a question. I think it's spot on from the perspective because one is that we have to be aware of our own maritime history. That one is usage in the absolute terms of what naval historians and others use, or modern terminology that we're using as maritime domain awareness. In the same way, we need to be aware of the maritime history. That is very important. I think educating students and the younger generation on maritime history is very important because we don't see ourselves as a maritime power, or we have been one in the past. I think we need to come out of that closet to think beyond that we are capable of. We were a great power, and we were a maritime great power, and we will, if we just have to reinvent ourselves. I think no doubt about it. I think that advisory body will be of great help. It should not end up being another a bureaucratic body, but it should be of a body which, irrespective of the positions and the place, people should be able to take the suggestions given there. I think once we start valuing the suggestions more than the individuals, I think it makes more sense and India will be able to move in the right way. That's my take here.
Thank you so much for your answer. And thank you so much, all the speakers.
I'm sorry, sir. We have a question from Yoichiro Sato, sir, from Japan. If we can take up this last question.
Yeah, we can do that. Go ahead.
India's energy supply increasingly depends on the Persian Gulf region. How and with whom would India cooperate to secure this interest? Probably Deshmukh sir or Nand Kishore sir, if you want to take up this question.
Probably Deshmukh ji can take this.
Thank you very much. It's a very pertinent question. Our energy security obviously depends on the Middle East area, and we have got our own partnership with Iran and the Middle East countries. It's a fact that India's own resources in the petroleum area are not up to the mark, and we have to import oil to meet our own requirements. India is very much conscious of the thing, what is happening in that particular region, and what are the threats which are coming about because of the what we call the Belt and Road Initiative. So all these factors keeping in mind, India has been concise and has been developing its relations with Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region to safeguard its own energy interests and taking care of its own oil imports and the passages, securing the safe passage of the ships and the oil platforms into the Indian country. So the collaboration with the various Middle East countries, the list will be far too long to provide in this particular forum as such. But that is one aspect. Other aspect itself is banking on to the what we call the renewable energy as well as the unconventional energy sources, and it is focusing more on the electric vehicles and on that kind of a sector to bring down the hydrocarbon usage, because not only we have to bring down our dependence on the carbon fuels, but carbon footprint, the environment protection also in India is one of the most important priorities. So unconventional energy issues are also being addressed. And I'm quite sure that within next 5 to 7 years, India will be energy sufficient. I hope I have answered your questions. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Commodore Deshmukh. The issue of protecting our assets or protecting our trade it's not something new. It's something that we've been doing. The fact that we have formed the Quad and the AUKUS and are a part of, hopefully will be a part of the AUKUS, is the fact eventually that we need to protect our assets, issues, and we need alliance. Whatever be the other issues, we need to be clear that we can't do this alone. We have to have our alliances protecting us. Thank you so much, Commodore Deshmukh, Commodore Johnson, and Dr. Nand Kishore for your excellent presentation. And indeed, we're very happy to hear whatever you all have said. I now sign off from our first session, and thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for
All the best.
sharing
Thank
the
you, sir.
so successfully.
Thank you.